Thanks everyone for joining today, the Dr. Jaspersoft webinar, office hours. That we do once a month on a second Thursday, normally on a second Thursday of the month. There's an exception for the August session today. Let me start the presentation. So hopefully you can all see the presentation full screen. So today we're going to talk about SSO configuration and a little demo and configuration testing. So single sign-on on JasperReports Server, in particular using OpenID Connect and using AWS Cognito as an IDP. And so with us today, we have Keith Meadows, who's a senior customer success architect, who's going to be our technical presenter, our guest presenter. And obviously myself, Kamal Kumlin, also a customer success architect with TIPCO, and Badr Draifi, also a CSA. Just a quick note on our next session, which, as I said, it's the second Thursday of every month. So September 9th, we'll have our next session. As soon in a few days after this one, we'll post the details on the topic. We don't have the topic defined at the moment, but we'll post that soon on our website. And this is the agenda for today. So I'm gonna let Keith take over now and present our topic. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Keith Meadows. I am a customer success architect here, as Kamal said, with TIPCO Jaspersoft. And today we're going to talk a little bit about OpenID Connect against Amazon Cognito. As you can see the agenda here, we're going to do a small overview of OpenID, Cognito and what they are, talk a little bit about the authentication flow and authentication against Cognito with JRS. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the caveats and some troubleshooting steps when working with it. Next slide.
And before we continue, just a quick note, I forgot to mention, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A button or Q&A section in Zoom, and we'll answer them either in writing there or at the end of the session. We'll answer your questions directly. Thanks.
So first off, a little bit about OpenID Connect. It is an identity and authentication layer that's actually built on top of OAuth 2.0 specification and framework. OAuth 2.0 allows for authorization, and the OpenID Connect is an extension of that to allow for authentication. It uses what they call JSON Web Tokens, which you can obtain through the OAuth 2.0 specification and flows. So you can see here, OAuth 2.0, as I said, is an authorization framework, and OpenID is built on top of that. Now, in conjunction, they kind of work together to provide everything you need for authentication and authorization in an open format. Next slide. Amazon Cognito is actually an identity provider that speaks various specifications for authentication and authorization, and one of them is OpenID and OAuth 2.0. You can also use Amazon Cognito to centralize your authentication, as it will connect to third-party applications like Facebook, Amazon, Google, using OAuth 2 or OpenID specifications. So you can basically take federated user stores that you may have, and you can connect them to Cognito as a central identity provider. We're not going to really cover that. That's not in scope today. We're going to kind of cover just user pools and connecting. So the two main components of Cognito are user pools and identity pools. User pools are directories or external directories that you're connected to, like Facebook or Google, and it provides sign up and sign in options for the users for your applications. Identity pools enable you to grant access to other AWS services. That's a little out of scope today as well. We're going to talk specifically about user pools. and the demo is going to be against my local instance, so that you can see that you can basically authenticate from anywhere with Cognito. But you can also authenticate with Cognito and grab authentication keys from identity pools to contact and leverage other Amazon Web Services. Next slide. So a little bit about the OpenID Connect authentication flow. So for an OpenID scope with an authentication code grant request, this is the particular flow that happens for authentication. So the client will request for authentication and authorization to an authorization endpoint that will bring up a login box where the user will log in. After that, the server will return an authorization code, or the identity provider will return an authorization code back to Jasper. Jasper will then request a token from the token endpoint using the authorization code, and that will retrieve an ID token or an access token. Access tokens are more for OAuth 2.0 specification, as you can pass those around to various resource servers that you may have specified. ID tokens are actually the JWT JSON Web Tokens that will be returned and that can be processed for identity purposes and authentication. Next slide. A little bit about how AWS Cognito and JRS authenticate with each other. So for steps 1 and 2 here, it's submitting the credentials and obtaining an ID and access token. That will refer to the previous slide for the flow, which is the authorization code grant flow. After you've retrieved an ID token, you can see here that the request to JRS is sent with the token. The Java Web Key Store is then used to verify the token and process the request. And then you will be given access to the JRS application as a resource server. So this is the overall flow with Cognito, and then Cognito speaks OpenID Connect specification with JRS, JasperReports Server. Next slide. So a little bit about what a JSON Web Token is. So you can see here it's an open standard of a JSON object. It can be verified and trusted because it is digitally signed using keys in the Java Web Key Stores. They can be signed with HMAC or public-private key, and they can be encrypted for security as well. So they are pretty secure and they are verifiable. Next slide. A few caveats with the implementation. So the implementation currently only does the authorization code grant flow. There are other OAuth 2 flows that are available. User credentials is one of them. Implicit grant is one of them for JavaScript frameworks. But JRS does the authorization code grant flow, and then it provides header-based JWT processing for visualized JS framework or embedding with REST. So you do have the ability to have a client retrieve a JWT via some flow from an IDP and then passing it to Jasper Server to be verified and processed for embedding purposes. The other caveat to it is that the claim processing is typically needs to be customized for any required business logic. So anything you want to pull from your JWT as far as claims or user detail information or profile attributes. So that is one particular step with the package. And then, as you can see below, and I said before, using Visualize.js, you will need to retrieve the JWT and pass it in the authorization header for implicit grant usage. Next slide. A little bit about troubleshooting. So the best troubleshooting that you can do with the source and the framework is to turn on logging for the following package that's shown here. You can do that under manage server settings, log settings on the server. And then As you'll see when we go through the demo, there is some configuration around audience and issuer settings, as well as the URLs and keys for the Java Web Key Store. So those are always good to just verify and make sure that they are all correct.
Hey Keith, quick question for me on that package. Is that a out of the box kind of a vanilla package in JasperReports Server, or is that custom by any chance?
So it is not an out of the box package. It is a custom accelerator.
Okay.
It is available as part of the Upshift program that we offer clients. It offers accelerators and customizations, as well as time with a dedicated CSM and a CSA like Kamal or myself.
Thank you. And I guess we can talk a little bit more later about options for whoever doesn't have access to that. They will have to do this somehow by themselves, and obviously support that by themselves. But thanks for that. I'm gonna go next, I suppose.
Yep. So let's get a little bit into the demo. Here's the high level steps of what we're going to do. We're going to create a user pool and a user in Cognito. We're going to register JRS as an application with Cognito, and then we're going to configure JRS with the specific properties from Cognito, install some libraries, copy in the config file, restart Tomcat, and run some tests.
Thanks, Keith. Just again, a quick reminder for everyone attending, please use the Q&A at any time to ask your questions, and we'll answer them as soon as we can. So I'll stop sharing here, Keith, and let you go ahead with the demo.
All right. Okay, so first we're going to come into our AWS Management Console and visit the Cognito service. And within Cognito, we're going to manage user pools. And we're going to create a new user pool. And we'll name it, Dr. Jasper Demo. And we'll step through some settings here. All these are standard settings around how you want users to authenticate, what policies you want to have. You're allowed to have multi-factor. Cognito pretty much provides all of the standard identity provider functionality. So some of this will apply to other identity providers like Ping or Okta or some of the other ones that are out there. So we'll step through here. We don't really want to bring in any more standard attributes, but these are the standard claims that you can bring over in your JSON Web Tokens. I'm going to select the name here just to bring it over, and profile. This is the policies tab where you set your password policies. I'm going to set to allow administrators right now, and we'll remove this one just to make it a little easier. This is where you can enable multi-factor for your users. I'm going to skip this portion. You can have SES messages sent. These are tags for Amazon. You can remember user devices. And then this particular one is the one we're going to be most concerned with. So we have an app client, and this will be a client to this user pool. So we're going to add an app client, and we'll name it JRS app. You can set your token expirations here. We definitely want to generate a secret, and you can set what authentication flows are enabled against this this user pool. I'm going to leave these mostly at defaults. So we'll create the app client, and we'll go to the next step. You can have workflow triggers, you can customize the UI, and you can do various other things here. So I'm going to create the pool. And it gives me a pool ID, and it gives me the various settings that I have. So now we can go back through here and set up a few other things on our app client. So this app client is available now. We have a client ID, we have a secret. and we have our settings. The main things we care about here are the client ID and the secret, and you'll see that here in a little bit. We'll go down here to the app integration. And this is where we will configure a few things here shortly. We're going to enable the Cognito user pool as an identity provider. We will allow the OAuth flow of authorization code grant, and we will allow OpenID and profile. And these two, this is to grab your profile with your claims. And the OpenID is specifying that we want an ID token and that we are going to process JWTs in OpenID Connect. The other item here is the callback URL, and that is a redirect URL that we will configure. I'll come back to that here in just a second. And then we're going to set up a domain name, which is going to make this Cognito identity provider public for us. So I'm going to pick Dr. Jasper Demo. It is available. I want to save those changes. You can do some UI customization on things as far as the login page that pops up. You can add more resource servers and custom scopes. So this is all kind of a little out of scope for what we're doing today. And then if you go to Federation down here, this is where you can bring in all of your external providers into Cognito and do attribute mapping between those attributes and the ones that you want to pass in your claims and in your logins for users. Okay, so we have this set up, and this guy's here. So let's go talk a little bit about these configuration files. So there are some additional libraries here that we'll need to copy over. These will copy over onto my server under the WebINF lib folder here, and I'll show you this so that you can see the overall folder. I'm using Jasper 7.9, and I'm in the WebINF, and I will go down to lib.
Hey Keith, do you mind expanding a bit the name, the file name, so we can see the full file names there? Just as an extra thing.
For the right one or the left?
Yeah, the left, on the left, the ones that you're adding.
There we go.
Thanks.
All right, so we'll copy those in here. It's probably going to ask me to replace them. I will just replace them all. And then we have an application context file. And this particular framework is built off of our external authentication framework, which is what most of the out-of-box items, if not all, are built upon. So inside this file here, you'll see, some of you may be familiar with this file, but you'll see the bean definitions for all the beans required for Spring for the external authentication and single sign-on. So as we go down through this file here, so you have a filter processes URL, and this is the relative URL that is going to process your JWT tokens and perform your OAuth authentication. We have an authorization location, and this comes from Cognito. It's usually a relative path here to an authorized endpoint, and then you have your IDP domain. We have the client ID. We have the redirect URL, and this is going to be where the IDP redirects back to with the JWT or the access tokens. And as you can see, it is the relative path /OAuth that matches this particular URL. So this configuration will process this URL. We have the token location, which is the token endpoint for Cognito. It's also fairly standard. We have the client secret. We have the scopes, and these really don't need to be modified, but as you can see, they are the same as the ones that we selected for OpenID and profile. And then you have a token method for your token endpoint. So you can perform a get, or you can perform a post to the token endpoint. As you scan further down the file, there'll be a little more configuration in similar fashion here for the provider. So the provider is going to process your JWT token, your JSON Web Token when it comes back, and there'll be a few checks. So it's going to check the issuer that comes in. And this is actually, the value can differ between identity providers. So it's usually in the documentation. But for Cognito, it is the URL to the IDP and then the pool ID on the end of the URL. It'll also do an audience check. That can differ as well between IDPs. So for Cognito, it is actually the client ID. Then you also have the client ID, and we have the JSON Web Key Store URL. This is based on a specification, so there's typically a well-known URL that's exposed for an identity provider, and this relative path will be appended to it's the base path. I believe it's for the IDP right here. So for now, and most identity providers, you can just provide the relative path to the well-known URL. And you can actually go to this in your browser if you can attach the identity provider's domain name on the front, and it should return your keys that are going to be used for signature verification and encryption, decryption purposes. The rest of the file is pretty much standard out of the box user processors and synchronizers and things that synchronize the users and bring them across. They are a standard part of the external authentication framework. I'm not really going to go into depth on configuring those specifically, but there is documentation out there for the external auth framework that you can go view and learn a little bit more about them and how to configure them. So those are the items that we need to actually configure. So I'm going to take the first one, which is the most simple, and it's the redirect URL here. And I'm going to go back to my app client settings. And I'm not sure why that's on. And for the callback URL, I'm going to put that in there. And for the logout URL, I'm going to send it to just logout.html for Jasper, and that's for single sign-out purposes. I'm going to choose these again because for some reason these didn't highlight, and I'll save these. Okay, so the app client is configured. I have a domain, and everything should be good on this side of things. Now, what I also need is I need the client ID and the client secret here, and I need to modify the URLs that are actually in that file. So let's go back to the file. So we want the authorization location. We can find that. Let me look, because it's actually an example there. So we have, it'll be Dr. Jasper demo. So this is our publicly exposed URL, and it'll be to the authorized endpoint. And then it'll want the client ID. So let's go pull the client ID. And we'll put the client ID here. I'm actually going to go down and go ahead and put the client ID here. And I'm going to put it here for the audience as required. Okay. I'm going to copy my secret, and I'm going to populate my client secret. I'm going to set my token location. So it's Dr. Jasper demo. That's my public URL for my IDP, and it's to the token endpoint here. And this part is configured. We'll go down here. We've configured the audience. We've configured the client ID, but we don't really need to touch this one, and we need this one. So this part of the URL stay the same, and I need my user pool ID. So let's go back. We'll go to general settings, and you'll see the pool ID right here. So we'll copy that. We'll paste this in here. And now the file's configured. So I'll save that. I'll come up here and copy this. And this will go into WebINF. All right, so I'm going to bring my Jasper server up. All right, so Jasper server's coming up. Last step, we need a user. So we'll create a user. Dr. Jasper. Don't need an invitation. Password on it. All right, so now I have a Dr. Jasper user in my user pool. So once we get the server to come up,
Hey Keith, as that's loading, I use the time to ask you a quick question. So in your case, obviously you're running JRS locally. Okay, this I think looks like it's starting. So I'll finish up the question anyway. But if somebody's running JRS in AWS directly, does that change anything much in terms of the configuration that needs to be done, or is that pretty much the same?
I mean, you might have to modify your security groups, but basically the identity provider is public. It has its own public domain, public URL. So anything that can access it. So if I have a machine inside a VPC, it either needs to have a gateway where it can talk outside of your network to the public internet, or
but the client needs direct access, like the browser.
Yes, specific access. Yeah, but that's only in AWS, right? Because you have the security around between the outside internet and what's internal to your networks. So as long as you open that up in some manner and you can, you know, contact the public URL to your identity provider, then you can do it from anywhere.
Okay. I have a follow-up question, but I'll ask you later. I'll let you go with the demo. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So to initiate or initialize authentication, we're going to go to the OAuth URL here. And this will redirect you out to Amazon Cognito. And I'm going to log in here. It's probably going to make me change my password. And we're in. And we are in as Dr. Jasper. The way that it's particularly written now, there's not a lot of business logic. So it's pulling the default organization. You can come in here and you can see all the stuff under the default organization, anything under public, and, you know, your standard out of box Jasper here. So, you know, for the demo here, it's not bringing in over any profile attributes or roles. You know, that functionality is there and it's possible, and it's possible to put business logic around it as well. So that's all for the demo. We can go ahead and I'll stop sharing and we can switch back to the slides.
Actually, before you stop sharing, the first question I have, I don't see at the moment, I don't know if there are any questions in Q&A, but Butter can maybe check as well. But the first question, but you just mentioned about the organization. So in case of multi-org or multi-tenancy setup, how would you go about associating a specific organization to a user?
So that can be done a couple of ways. You can either pass it over in the claim. It'll come over in the JSON Web Token as a claim, and you can process it from there. If you want to pass it from the JasperReports application here, there's a little bit that needs to be done to make that happen, but you can put it on the OAuth URL that I initialized authentication with. So I can do a query string parameter like org ID and give it the org ID that I want. And then there are some modifications that have to be done in the source to pass that in over to the identity provider as a value, and then the identity provider needs to have some attribute mapping to basically echo it back as an org ID in the JSON Web Token as a claim, and then we can process it. So there are a couple of ways to do it. It can either come directly from the external system, or it can be specified when starting from Jasper and pass through the external system and back. So,
and if I were to set it in Cognito directly, right? I could set that as a, let's say, profile and then use it for the org ID. Is that how it would work?
Yeah. So what you do is you would come here to attributes and see these are standard attributes right here. You can add your own custom attributes.
Okay.
That will come over as a claim. And then if you are mapping,
it will come back in the JWT, right?
Right.
Okay.
And even if you are pulling from one of these federated items, underneath there's attribute mapping, and you can map attributes from your Google provider that you want to come across and go in your claim. So if you have something that can fill in as an organization ID, you can bring that right over. And I'm pretty sure most identity providers provide this, but when you start doing custom things with scopes and attributes, there's usually an expression language and a way to do conditional things. So it's fairly flexible.
And related to this, would you have a JWT to show like how it looks like inside? Is that something you could show, or just to see a sample JWT that would be returned? I don't know if that's complicated.
So I did not. I do not have an example directly of that, but let me see if I can open up developer tools and catch a post on it. So I'll log back out. I'll log back in. It should be seamless this time because I'm already logged into my single sign-on. And let's see, what was the first request that came through here? There we go. So this was the get. That's the request for the code.
It would be in the response header, or in the would be returned as part of the body actually, or you know?
So the code's returned, it's a post, and then it's returned in a response. So that's part of it. Is I'd have to catch it in the response. And I don't see the post here. So
it's fine anyway.
Let me see if I can do this real quick, because you know it may be help. So we'll do an example JSON Web Token, right? And it'll just give you an idea of the format. And this is one of the actual links that's in our resources. So there's a lot more information in the resources at the bottom on JSON Web Tokens, OpenID, flows, and Amazon Cognito as a whole. So a JSON Web Token has a particular structure. There's a header, a payload, and a signature. They're all separated by a period. And then you can take them and base 64 decode each particular section except for the last one, which is the signature. So let's scan down here and see if we have an example. So in this particular graph, let me see if I can zoom this up just a little bit. All right, so they've taken their JSON Web Token and put it in their decoder here. And it's all base 64 encoded. So here's the header values. It's got the encryption algorithm and the type of JWT. Here's the payload, which is what we typically care about and process. And it has claims for sub, name, admin, and this is where your other claim values that you would process would be located, would be in the payload. And then the last portion is the actual signature. So it is the portion that is used to verify who signed the JWT and that it came from a particular machine. And it's based on public-private key encryption. So kind of like certificates in SSL and most everything. So that's the typical structure of a JWT. Okay,
thanks. That makes sense. And I suppose if you're troubleshooting, a problem in this setup, one of the things you might be looking at would be the actual payload of the JWT, right? To see, hey, I'm actually getting what's expected in terms of usernames and all these, potential other attributes. So
that is correct, and you can either retrieve it either from the dev console, and it's also in the logging. So if you turn on the debug logging per the troubleshooting section here, you'll be able to get your hands on the JWT and put it in a decoder and see the values. So yeah, that is a good thing for troubleshooting.
That was going to be my next question, actually, about typical issues that you've seen, in customer environments, and how typically you would go about, troubleshooting them or resolving them. Can you give some maybe couple of examples?
The main ones would be the keys, right? So the keys have to be the right keys for encryption, decryption, and signature verification. So you definitely want to verify your keys at your key store location or your well-known key store location. The matches that occur on issuer. So like I said, the issuer and the audience can vary between an identity provider, like what it expects. So you'll probably have to check your documentation for reference for your identity provider. But a lot of times it's typically the value for this or this that will cause issues. And then beyond that, it's signature verification and encryption. So the other thing that can happen is the scopes. So for OpenID, you definitely have to have OpenID in profile. If you wanted to do an OAuth 2 and request some other flow, you could take OpenID off here and it would just return you access tokens, and it wouldn't work with this particular implementation. Most of this stuff like the token location and the authorized location, those will come from your documentation for your identity provider. And then the redirect URL, that is always to the Jasper Server Pro URL, and the end relative part that's appended is also what you specify here. Right, so if I were to change this to /OIDC, and then I would change this to /OIDC, and then when I wanted to authenticate, I would have to go to /OIDC here. So those are the main areas of concern or areas to check. Debug logging actually tells you quite a bit about what it's checking and what fails and things like that. So that's the first location to start.
You mentioned in the slides that you could set to debug that particular package. So I don't know, would you be able to show a little bit, even just the signature of that package, or what in terms of the methods that need to be there? We don't have to see the whole code, obviously, but just to see, get an idea of how would you go about building that custom package.
We do also have a question from Swapnil. We're gonna get to it once.
So what do you mean building it? So you're talking about like building a source for it?
No, I mean, that custom package that you showed that would need to be enabled for debugging, right? You showed in the slides. The actual code of that package, without showing necessarily the whole code, but just the signature in terms of, the methods that need to be there. Just if somebody wants to go and do that themselves, would you be able to show a little bit of that?
To do what? Turn on the logging for it?
No, the actual code of that package, the ps.oidc, without showing as I said, the whole code, just to give an idea of what if somebody wants to build that by themselves. Maybe just the methods, that are required there.
Considerable amount of those, so I don't really want to go in.
Sure.
But
just to get a quick idea, like again, we don't have to show the whole code, if that's possible.
Let's go here. I'll go into my workspace here. So in my workspace here, there's the source. It's all under one package. But there are a considerable amount of classes here. So these are all, they're all the classes used for standard Spring authentication. So this is all built off of the Spring framework. There are some additional dependencies in here, like Apache L2 to do, the handshake and different things. But, this is this particular package too. We have things that work for Keycloak, and there's actually one that's a rewrite on this that removes a few dependencies because there's some of the products. So,
and these are built like completely from scratch, or is that something where people could start from, to not build everything from scratch? Is that they're completely newly built classes, or did we start from some, I don't know, template or something like that?
These are all completely newly built, but if you wanted to start something on your own, you could probably pull our SSO template sample and the source associated with it. Or you could even probably start with the pre-authentication.
Okay. So, and could you show briefly where that might be for people to find the SSO template you mentioned?
Sure. So let me pull up the other folder here. So under your Jasper installation, there will be a folder called samples, and under samples you have external auth sample config, and this contains all of the out-of-box external auth configurations that you can do. The template is here.
So that's for the configuration, but for the actual code, Java code, we don't have anything that's publicly available, right? That
yes, if you download the source code and you have access on eDelivery to the source code, all this source is available. So any of these class definitions here, all that source is available.
So somebody could build their own package, OIDC package from those, starting from those.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Or they could even start with the pre-auth one here, and
start from those classes, and okay.
Start from these classes like the base pre-auth. That's actually the particular implementation that this is built from, because it is kind of a standard pre-auth.
I also guess we do have this auth implementation, Kate. I think you already made it in the community.
There's like some source that's like probably older 4.x, 5.x, Spring 3, or an older Spring version that's out there publicly, but
does that use OpenID as well?
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
For OAuth 2.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's on GitHub as far as I know, and so for people to know, but in general, would you say that it requires quite a bit of knowledge of Spring and also OpenID technology, I assume, to build that package from this pre-auth sample code, right? Starting code.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fair enough. And that's why, just to repeat what Keith said earlier, generally, in the customer success team, we help customers build and configure this type of setups, because it's quite an advanced task. It requires quite a bit of knowledge. This gave you quite a bit of good introduction to everything, but obviously If you had to build that package by yourself, it would take considerable knowledge. So just to make it clear for everyone. And what Keith mentioned before about e-delivery, so that's edelivery.tipco.com. That's obviously available to our customers to download the source code, but the source code of the commercial edition is not available publicly, obviously. So, but customers can, customers with licenses can download the source code and then start from there if they want. Whereas community users obviously can download the community edition, but that doesn't have, as far as I know, doesn't have SSO. Is that correct, Keith? Or I think it does, maybe for the pre-auth, no?
For what,
community
edition? I'm pretty sure the ones that are shown here that come out of box come with community as well.
The community. Okay. So basically, yeah, if you then you could start from that as well. If you have the community edition, if you're not a paying customer and using the free edition. So Badr, you mentioned there was a question. I didn't see it in the list. I think I have a problem with that. I've seen that before.
I have a question from Swapnil. He's saying, what's the validity of the particular GWT?
I guess the expiration time, it means.
That's what I think too.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So if you go back to your user pool here, that's password policies. Let's see, app client settings, I believe. No. Hold on just a second. App clients, show details. Okay, so right now, so refresh tokens and access tokens are specific to OAuth 2 and resource servers and authorizations. So what we're using right now is an ID token. So right now it's 60 minutes on my ID tokens. Now, that's not necessarily tied to my Jasper session. So, you know, I get a token, you get a token, Jasper gets a token, authenticates, and then there's a 20-minute timeout on Jasper as an application that it'll adhere to. What the token validity here means is if I were to pass in the token again, you know, 60 minutes from now, it would be invalid. Or if I were to try to single sign on again through the flow later than 60 minutes from now, it would have expired and it would pop up the login box.
Isn't that a bit long, 60 minutes? It feels like in terms of security.
Absolutely. I would lower that to 10, 15 seconds, honestly. Mm-hmm. And then it would be really secure and it would be a new token for each request. But I mean,
it says
really,
5 minutes here.
Well, really, so you could do stuff in Jasper, but if you did close your browser or whatever and bring it up and go to /OAuth again, and it was short set real low, it would force me to go to the login box versus, you know, as long as my session hasn't been killed, when it goes back, it's single sign-on. So if my token's still valid, it sends it back to Jasper and then it processes it because the expiration time's valid. So it allows you to not have to log in as frequently, right? And if you want to log out, you're supposed to do a single sign out, and that kills the token across the board. And then it will call your URL. Let me see, where's this app client settings here? So this is your single sign out URL. So if you were to call single sign out, Cognito would then call Jasper as an application after killing the token and kill the session here. So that's kind of how it operates. As far
so
as
my understanding of the expiration of these tokens, the main purpose is that you don't want them to be too long, because if somebody steals the token somehow from you, from the browser or from the network, you know, it should be hard because of, you know, encryption and everything. But if they steal the token, in theory, they could re-authenticate.
Yes, it'll help prevent a replay attack. Right. Really, best practice is going to be to encrypt them as well, and then you don't have to worry about that. So, because it's encrypted and signed, so they would have to. I mean, it's, you know, it's signed, and so doing a man in the middle like that or something would be really hard to do with encryption and signature verification.
Right. And just to clarify for everyone, I mean, the session expiration in Jasper, that's simply typically set by default 30 minutes, I think. And it's just if the user doesn't do anything for that amount of time, then after that time, the session will expire and they would have to authenticate again.
So this is kind of a mesh up. So you have OAuth 2 with JWT processing, and then the JWT processing with encryption and signature verification is similar to how they do SAML and SAML assertions. And those are fairly secure because they're signed and encrypted. And, really, unless somebody can break the encryption or get their hands on the keys, it's the private keys, then it's typically hard to break that thing, to hack in any manner or for it to be insecure. So, so it's fairly secure.
So we have about 5 minutes left in the webinar. So very final question for me is, so going back to the follow-up that I mentioned before. So can the IDP be in a VPN, right? So not be on the public internet. Let's assuming, for example, both Jasper and Cognito are in AWS. Could the IDP be not public if somebody's concerned about that, or does it have to be public?
No, I attached a public domain name to it in our steps today, but you don't have to do that. It can use a private
network within AWS.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so Badr, any final questions from you? Or
no, not really here. Just want to add that Swapnil answered back in the chat and said, okay, thanks, that answered my question for information, Keith.
Perfect.
Yeah, no problem. Great.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so I'm gonna start sharing again just to show the final couple slides. So we have some resources. So let me see. Yeah, can you guys see the slides? So simply some final resources. We share this PDF. This presentation as a PDF on the wiki page of Dr. Jaspersoft. So you'll have all the links here, and you can go back to the slides. And also, obviously, we'll have the recording of the session in our YouTube channel. You can find that easily in the Dr. Jaspersoft playlist. And so here are some resources and additional links. And that's pretty much all for today. Actually, one final thing, if you have questions, follow-up questions on the session, please use the Jaspersoft community website, the Q&A section, and you can tag the questions with Dr. Jasper, and we'll monitor that and answer as soon as we can. And also, finally, here you can see our email. So if you have follow-up questions on this session, please send us an email there, and we'll be in touch. So I think that's all for today. And thanks very much, Keith, for the session. It was very, very interesting, very useful. And thanks, Badr, for helping. And yeah, have a good day and talk to you soon, everyone. Thank you.